student went to bed in her room, but just minutes later, a fire broke out. When firefighters rushed in, something fell off right away. Police got involved, and detectives started piecing together a series of unsettling clues and testimonies. What they uncovered was a dark, tangled truth, one that would leave everyone shaken. Andrea Del Vesco was born on June 29, 1994, in Chicago, Illinois. She had an older brother, a younger sister, and parents she was incredibly close to. Andrea also came from a well-off family. Her dad ran an investment firm. After her little sister was born, the family moved to Austin, Texas, where Andrea enrolled in a prestigious Christian school. She stood out fast. She played on the field hockey and lacrosse teams and racked up a bunch of awards, especially for studying languages like Spanish and Latin. When she graduated, Andrea applied to several top colleges. In the end, she chose UCLA, planning to earn degrees in psychology and Spanish. She loved the language and seriously thought about moving to a Spanish-speaking country one day. Her parents had hoped she'd pick a university in Chicago because her older brother was studying there and could keep an eye on her. But they ultimately supported her choice, and she headed to California. In her first week on campus, she joined a sorority and quickly made friends. Andrea moved into the dorms with them and spent the next few years working hard toward her degrees. She also picked up part-time jobs whenever she could. Even though her family could provide everything she needed, she wanted to pull her own weight. In 2015, when Andrea was 21, she entered her senior year. At UCLA, sorority and fraternity members in their final years could rent small apartment-style complexes just off campus. It was considered a big deal, both prestigious and a chance to finally live a bit more independently outside the dorms. Andrea and her sorority friends jumped at the opportunity and rented a place just a short walk from the university. Around that same time, Andrea adopted a little chihuahua from a shelter, and soon after, she began volunteering there on a regular basis. September was an especially important month for her sorority. It was recruitment season when they welcomed new freshmen into the house, so Andrea and her friends were busy preparing for it. On the night of September 20th, they spent hours working together, setting up displays, painting posters, making decorations, and getting everything ready for the big event. As the night wore on, the girls started heading to their rooms one by one. Andrea stayed up with a friend in the living room, chatting until 3:30 in the morning. Eventually, she dozed off on the couch, but a little while later she woke up and went to her bedroom. A few hours later, Andrea's roommate, who lived upstairs, was suddenly woken by the sound of a woman screaming and a dog barking. The noise seemed to be coming from downstairs, so she tried calling her, but Andrea didn't pick up. Concerned, she decided to call the police, and officers arrived within minutes. By the time they entered the building, everything had gone quiet. They walked through the place but didn't find any signs of a break-in or anything unusual. Most of the other girls were still asleep, so the officers chose not to disturb them. Thinking it might have just been a nightmare or maybe nothing serious at all, they left. But only minutes later, Andrea's roommate heard a loud crash from below. She rushed out onto her balcony, and that's when she saw smoke pouring from Andrea's room, followed by flames spreading fast. To her shock, she also saw a man wrapped in a blanket running out of Andrea's room. At that moment, the fire alarms went off and the students started evacuating. Some of Andrea's friends tried to get into her room, but the door was locked. A strange detail, since the girls never locked their doors. Using a spare key, they finally got it open. Inside, Andrea's room was filled with smoke and flames. Through the haze, they could barely make out the outline of a person lying motionless on the bed. They shouted Andrea's name, but there was no answer. The fire spread too quickly, and they had no choice but to get out. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was in chaos. The students huddled outside, and it didn't take long for everyone to realize Andrea was missing. The fire spread quickly through the building, and it took 32 firefighters more than 15 minutes to finally put it out. When they were able to enter Andrea's room, they found a body lying on the bed, and that's when the police immediately got involved. The fire had done so much damage that the body couldn't be identified by sight. It was handed over to the medical examiner, but detectives quickly realized who it had to be. Other students told them that the room was Andrea's, and she was the only one who hadn't made it out that night. Firefighters also found Andrea's Chihuahua live in the room, and the dog was quickly taken to a vet clinic for treatment. Even though medical confirmation would take time, word of the tragedy spread across campus almost instantly. Within hours, thousands of students at UCLA had heard about it, and most assumed Andre had died in some kind of accident, maybe an electrical short or something like a candle left burning. But firefighters had their doubts right away. All the outlets were intact, and there was no sign of any accidental source of fire in the room. What they did notice was strange. Sitting on the bed right next to the body was a trash can. That in itself seemed suspicious. After looking more closely, they concluded that the fire had started there, which meant someone had put the trash can on the bed and deliberately set it on fire. It was nearly impossible to believe Andrea could have done that to herself. Firefighters shared their findings with the police, and soon, forensic investigators were going through the room in detail. What they discovered made the case even darker. There were large bloodstains spread across the bed and on the floor. That detail alone shattered the theory of a tragic accident, because in a real accidental fire, there would have been no reason for blood to be there at all. Meanwhile, the medical examiners worked to confirm the victim's identity, but the fire had been so intense that even her fingerprints were gone. In the end, they were able to confirm it was Andrea by using dental records. What they found next was shocking. Her body showed 19 stab wounds, which completely ruled out any possibility of an accident. There was another crucial detail. The examiners discovered no smoke in her lungs. That meant Andrea was already dead before the fire even started. As for sexual assault, there were no clear signs. But because the body was so badly damaged by the flames, they couldn't say for certain. What they could confirm was that there was no trace of the attacker's DNA left behind. The case was now officially a homicide investigation. ABD detectives began questioning all of the sorority members who lived in the complex. They learned Andrea didn't have a boyfriend at the time, and she didn't seem to have conflicts with anyone. One of the students, the same one who had called the police before the fire, shared an unsettling detail. That night, she had driven her boyfriend to the airport and got back home around 5:30 in the morning. She entered the courtyard of the sorority house, where the stairs led up to her room. As she walked up and started unlocking her door, she suddenly heard a noise behind her. When she turned around, she saw a man standing at the bottom of the stairs, and the moment he noticed her, he bolted. Frightened, she quickly went inside her room. She thought about calling the police, but convinced herself not to. Maybe he was just someone visiting one of the other girls, or maybe another student passing through. She hadn't seen his face clearly, but she remembered what he was wearing. A black baseball cap, a dark t-shirt, and jeans. Still unsettled, she phoned her boyfriend and told him what happened. He reassured her, and eventually she went to sleep. But just 45 minutes later, she woke to the sound of commotion downstairs. The same noise that made her call the police. After the officers left, she once again heard noises. Stepping out onto her balcony, she caught sight of a man climbing out of Andrea's window, wrapped in a red blanket, and she instantly knew it was the same guy she'd seen near the staircase less than an hour earlier. She shouted after him, but he ran off. She rushed outside, hoping to see where he went, but by then he was gone. What she did notice, though, was a red Nissan driving away from the area. She couldn't make out the license plate, but there was something else on the rear windshield. 3 big letters. She recognized them right away. It was the abbreviation of a fraternity called Lambda Chi Alpha. Detectives were intrigued by this lead, but they also knew it might not mean anything. That neighborhood was packed with students and notorious for big parties, so the red Nissan could have just belonged to some random college kid heading home from one of them. Still, investigators followed up. They questioned every member of Lambda Chi Alpha, the fraternity whose letters were spotted on the car, but none of them admitted to owning a red Nissan, nor did they know who it belonged to. Detectives then spoke with students who lived in the complex across the street from Andreas, and that's when they learned about another crime that same night. The students said their place had been burglarized. Someone had stolen a laptop, a Bluetooth speaker, and a few other items. This detail caught investigators' attention. They soon learned that in order to use that stolen Bluetooth speaker, the new owner would first have to register it online through the manufacturer's website. Detectives wasted no time. They reached out to the company, handed over the serial number, and asked to be alerted the moment someone tried to activate it. While detectives waited for a call, news of Andrea's death spread far beyond the UCLA campus. At first, investigators didn't reveal that they were dealing with the homicide. Most people, including Andrea's own family, believed she had died in some kind of tragic accident. Her parents only learned the awful truth later from Andrea's sorority sisters. By then, her family had already flown to Los Angeles. Her mother demanded to see the body herself because she couldn't bring herself to believe Andrea was really gone. As for Andrea's dog, vets tried desperately to save the little chihuahua, but it didn't make it. Heartbroken, her parents went to the clinic to say goodbye, and later said that at least the dog would now be with Andrea in heaven. Meanwhile, detectives were still chasing the lead on the red Nissan, but came up empty-handed. Days passed with no progress until the call finally came in. The stolen Bluetooth speaker had just been activated, and the detectives now had an IP address. Traced back to a man named Joseph, living in Fresno, about 3 hours away from UCLA. Police headed straight to his home, and Joseph admitted he had registered the speaker online, but insisted it wasn't his. He said it belonged to his roommate, a man named Alberto. According to Joseph, Alberto had left for Los Angeles a few days earlier to attend a concert and came back on September 22nd, just one day after Andrea's murder. When he returned, he wasn't empty-handed. He brought back the stolen Bluetooth speaker, along with other random items like dishes, towels, and bottles of alcohol. When asked where it all came from, Alberto told him a friend in Los Angeles had just moved and gave him the things he didn't want to take along. Detectives dug deeper and found out Alberto was a 22-year-old student at Fresno State University who had no criminal record. Still, his whereabouts were unclear, and it took investigators several days to track down the house he was staying in. On September 26th, officers surrounded the home and arrested Alberto. At the station, he claimed he had gone to Los Angeles to visit a friend who lived near UCLA. Together, they went to a concert, then spent the next few days hopping from party to party before he headed back home. When a detective asked him about the Bluetooth speaker, Alberto pretended not to know what they were talking about. But once they confronted him with proof that the stolen speaker had been found in his roommate's home, his story changed. Now, he said the speaker had actually been brought by his friend from Los Angeles, who supposedly gave him a ride back to Fresno. But detectives quickly uncovered another inconsistency. Alberto's own roommate told them he saw Alberto return home alone, carrying the speaker and the rest of the stolen items into the garage. Caught in the lie, Alberto switched his story again. This time, he admitted he had stolen them himself. He explained that he and his friend had gone to a student party that night where some of the people were acting rude. Drunk and annoyed, he decided to teach them a lesson by stealing their things, laptop, the speaker, and whatever else he could grab. He insisted he was so intoxicated that he barely knew what he was doing. Alberto added one more detail. He claimed that around 5:30 a.m. after leaving that party, he and his friend were confronted by a man hiding behind a dumpster. The man pulled out a gun and demanded their stuff. Instead of handing it over, they ran, and the stranger fired a shot in their direction. When detectives asked for a description of this gunman, Alberto gave one, and it matched perfectly with what Andrea's neighbor had seen that same night. Detectives, of course, weren't quick to buy Alberto's story, especially since no neighbors had reported hearing gunshots that morning. Still, they pressed him further, asking if he had gone into any women's dorms while he was in Los Angeles. Alberto said he had met 2 students through a mutual friend, but insisted that was the extent of it. Detectives pushed harder, telling him they didn't believe a word he was saying. Under pressure, Alberto changed his story yet again. This time, he claimed that during the same party where he'd stolen the speaker, his friend Eric had met a girl who lived just across the street and decided to go with her. Alberto said he didn't know her name, but when he gave a description, it matched Andrea. Then he went further. He described what she was wearing that night, even down to her underwear, and eventually slipped up and said her name. Detectives realized he was likely lying, spinning stories as he went along, but they also knew they had to squeeze out as many details as possible. When they pushed him to recall more, Alberto put his head in his hands, went silent for a few seconds, then finally muttered, "All right." It was Eric. According to Alberto, just minutes after Eric went off with the girl, he came running back, clearly shaken. He told Alberto they needed to get out of there immediately because he had done something serious. Eric admitted he had attacked the girl, and together they left the party. According to Alberto, Eric threw away a pair of rubber gloves as they left, gloves he'd been wearing when he came out of the student's house. Finally, Alberto claimed that sometime later, after the party, he saw news of Andrea's murder and realized what his friend had done. He messaged Eric, demanding the truth, and Eric confessed to killing her. Detectives still weren't convinced by Alberto's shifting story, but they had no choice but to check it out. They asked where Eric lived, and Alberto pointed them to an apartment complex just 5 minutes from Andrea's place. Police knocked on Eric's door and started asking questions about that night. Eric admitted that he and Alberto had been at the party, but claimed nothing unusual happened. According to him, they got back to his apartment around 3 a.m., and he didn't wake up until closer to 8. He also said he had been very drunk, so his memory of the night was fuzzy. Detectives kept pressing, but Eric stuck to his version. That's when police noticed something important. Eric's apartment complex had surveillance cameras everywhere, so they immediately pulled the footage from the night of Andrea's murder. What they saw blew holes in both men's stories. The footage showed Alberto and Eric walking back into the building at 2:40 a.m., and right away, detectives spotted something striking. One of them was wearing a black baseball cap, a dark t-shirt, and jeans, the exact outfit Andrea's neighbor had described. And it wasn't Eric. It was Alberto. Later footage showed both men leaving the apartment again around 4:30 a.m. They went downstairs, hung around drinking for a while, and then disappeared off camera. The next time they were seen was at 7:11 that morning, returning home. And there was no mistaking it. Alberta was wrapped in the very same red blanket Andrea's sorority sister had seen on the man fleeing her balcony. By this point, detectives had little doubt about Alberto's involvement, but they were still trying to figure out what role, if any, Eric had played. They brought him back in for questioning and showed him the surveillance footage, demanding he come clean. But Eric stuck to his story. He claimed he was so drunk, he barely remembered anything at all, not even leaving the apartment or where they had gone. Even so, investigators now had enough evidence to arrest both men and secure search warrants for their homes. Once they were booked into jail, officers noticed something troubling. Alberto's hands were covered in scratches. They looked exactly like defensive wounds, marked someone might leave behind while fighting him off. When asked about it, Alberto shrugged it off, saying he got into a fight at a party, but couldn't remember with whom. Soon after, forensic teams combed through Eric's apartment. They spotted stains that looked like someone had tried to wash away blood and quickly sent the samples to the lab for testing. Next, detectives tracked down Alberto's car, the red Nissan with the fraternity letters on the back window. It turned out Alberto had once been a member of Lambda Chi Alpha, but not at UCLA. He'd been a part of a chapter in Fresno before being kicked out for bad behavior. Finally, police searched Alberto's home. What they found left no room for doubt. A trash bag containing the same red blanket seen by Andrea's neighbor, a bloody knife, and Alberto's clothing, including his underwear. Even more disturbing, the bag also contained a pair of women's underwear. All of the evidence was sent to the lab for testing. In the meantime, one of Alberto's neighbors came forward with something that immediately caught detectives' attention. He said that when Alberto came back from Los Angeles, he told them that a student had been murdered right across the street from where he'd been at a party. What stood out wasn't just that Alberto knew about the killing, it was the level of detail. According to the neighbor, Alberto described the crime scene in graphic precision, that the victim had been assaulted, stabbed, and then the house was set on fire to cover it up. None of those details had ever been released publicly. Alberto even boasted that the police would never catch the person who did it, because the crime had been done too cleanly. Detectives strongly disagreed, though. They kept digging into the mountain of evidence piling up against him. When forensics finished processing Alberto's car, too was covered in blood. Samples from the vehicle, the knife, and Alberto's clothing all came back with the same result. The blood belonged to Andrea. With that confirmation, prosecutors moved forward. Both Alberto and Eric were formally charged with murder. But detectives still weren't convinced Eric had played an active role. He might not have even known what his friend had done. But with the evidence tying both men to the scene, they had little choice but to charge him alongside Alberto. After they were locked up and this information hit the news, a new witness came forward. He told police that around 5:30 that morning, he had been outside near Andrea's house collecting plastic bottles. While he was there, a man walked up to him and asked if he knew how to fight. The witness said no, and the man headed straight toward Andrea's building. The witness also noticed a red Nissan parked nearby, with another person sitting inside. When detectives brought him to the station, he immediately identified the man who had approached him. It was Alberto. This testimony became an important piece of the puzzle. It showed that Alberto had been the one who approached Andrea's home, while Eric had been sitting in the car. That made Eric's direct involvement in the murder seem even less likely, so investigators now leant toward the idea that Eric truly might not have known what his friend was about to do. Eventually, prosecutors changed Eric's charges. Instead of murder, he now faced counts of aiding and abetting, along with burglary from the other house that night. In 2017, Eric's lawyer negotiated a deal. The prosecution agreed to try him separately from Alberto. Eric pled guilty to the reduced charges and was sentenced to 2 years and 8 months in prison. Alberto's trial began in 2018, and by then, prosecutors had added another charge, animal cruelty, because of the death of Andrea's dog. The prosecution laid out an overwhelming case against him. They argued that Alberto had climbed into Andrea's home through the balcony. Maybe at first he didn't plan to kill her. Maybe he just wanted to steal something valuable. But when Andrea woke up and saw him, she screamed. That's when, according to prosecutors, he pulled a knife, sexually assaulted her, and stabbed her repeatedly. Afterward, he set a trash can on fire to destroy evidence, grabbed a blanket, and fled the scene. The defense, on the other hand, had nothing substantial to counter the evidence. They couldn't present a single strong argument for his innocence. So it didn't take long for the jury to reach their decision. Alberto was guilty on all counts. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for September 21st, exactly 3 years to the day after Andrea's murder. On that date, the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He emphasized one thing in particular. Throughout the entire trial, Alberto had never shown an ounce of remorse and never admitted to what he had done. In the end, Alberto was sent away to serve his life sentence. But even after the trial was over, one detail continued to haunt Andrea's parents. As we know, Andrea's roommate had already called the police before the fire even started, and based on the timeline, Alberto was likely still inside her room when the officers arrived. He probably stayed hidden, waiting for them to leave, or maybe even threatened her with a knife to keep her silent. That left a painful question Andrea's parents could never escape. Was Andrea already dead at that point, or was she alive, silenced by Alberto at knife point, too terrified to make a sound? They'll never know for sure, but in their eyes, one thing was clear. If police had checked Andrea's room that night, their daughter might have had a chance to survive. Her parents repeatedly criticized the police department for failing to conduct a more thorough search, but no action was ever taken against the officers. Their explanation was that when they walked through the house, they saw nothing to suggest danger. No signs of forced entry, no sounds of a struggle, only silence. And without stronger evidence, they said, they didn't have enough cause to take further steps. Share your thoughts in the comment section and don't forget to press the like button if you appreciate my video. A mother of 2 vanished under strange circumstances, leaving behind a string of unsettling messages to her family. Police jumped on the case right away, trying to make sense of a web of contradictions. But not even the most seasoned detectives could have imagined where this investigation would lead. What began as a missing persons case soon spiraled into a story that would shock the entire country. Katie Kenyon was born in 1983 in the small British town of Burnley. She had two sisters, older and younger, and the three of them were incredibly close. Even as a kid, Katie stood out for her kindness and generosity. She was the type of person who would drop everything to help someone in need. Later in life, she got married and had two kids, a son and a daughter. But eventually, her husband left the family. He still saw the kids from time to time, but from that point on, Katie was raising them on her own, which wasn't easy. She worked as a social care worker, and her paycheck barely covered the basics. But no matter how hard things got, Katie did everything she could to make sure her children had what they needed. On the morning of April 2nd, 2022, 33-year-old Katie went about her usual routine, got her kids ready, and sent them off to school. But just a few hours later, around noon, her mom got a text from her that felt totally off. Katie said she needed some time away to clear her head and would be gone for a while. Her mom tried calling right away, but the call went straight to voicemail. And that's when the panic really started to set in. She knew Katie had been struggling with anxiety for years, mostly from all the stress in her life. But the idea that she'd just walk away from everything, especially her kids, that just didn't add up. Her mom got in touch with Katie's sisters, and none of them believed the message either. They rushed over to her house and noticed that her car was gone. Using a spare key, they let themselves inside and found all of Katie's belongings right where she'd left them, except for her phone and handbag. It just didn't add up. The idea that Katie had taken off somewhere, leaving behind almost everything she owned, felt completely wrong. Something was off. A little while later, Katie's kids came home from school, and they had something to say too. They'd both received strange messages from their mom. In the text, she said she needed to get help so she could be a better mother and asked them to contact their dad so he could look after them while she was away. As soon as they read the messages, Katie's mom and sisters started seriously doubting that she'd written them. First of all, the tone didn't sound like her at all. But more importantly, there was something else that really stood out. In both messages, the word "while" was misspelled, and that just didn't make sense because Katie never made mistakes like that. Then her son mentioned something else. He said a man named Andrew had messaged him on social media. Andrew was Katie's ex, someone she dated for several years. In the message, he said Katie had checked herself into a clinic and asked him to take care of her dog until she got back. Katie's mom and sisters thought the whole thing was pretty strange. Sure, they'd known she'd dated Andy for a long time, but it had never been a smooth relationship. The two of them were on and off constantly. As far as her family knew, they weren't even together anymore. So it didn't make much sense that Katie would fill him in on her plans, but not say a word to her own mother or kids. In the messages she'd sent her son and daughter, Katie had also mentioned Andy. She said that if their dad couldn't look after them, Andy would step in. One of Katie's sisters eventually got a hold of his number and gave him a call. Andy told her he hadn't seen Katie since the day before, since he'd been at work all morning. He said that around 2 p.m., she texted him saying she was going to drop her car off at his place and that she was leaving the keys and her bank card in his mailbox. Katie had owed Andy a large sum of money, about £6,000, for anxiety treatment he'd helped her pay for in the past. So, according to him, this was her way of paying him back. In her next message, Katie said she was heading back to a clinic because she just couldn't handle the anxiety anymore. Andy said nothing about it struck him as odd, so he didn't think much of it. Still, Katie's sister wasn't buying Andy's story. Not one bit. So, she and her boyfriend decided to drive over to his place and see for themselves. The moment they pulled up, she spotted Katie's car parked outside. Inside, she could see Katie's purse and other personal belongings, which only made her more suspicious. She knocked on Andy's door, hoping to talk to him face to face, but he refused to open it and told them to leave. The whole thing felt incredibly off. Katie's sister couldn't wrap her head around why Andy didn't seem the slightest bit worried or why he was being so uncooperative. Her boyfriend ended up threatening to kick the door down if he didn't let them in, but Andy just called the police instead. A few minutes later, officers arrived and spoke with Katie's sister first. She laid everything out, how the family was worried sick, how they didn't believe for a second that Katie would just vanish without saying a word to anyone. She also pointed out her sister's car still parked there with her stuff inside. After that, the police knocked on Andy's door. He gave them the same story he told over the phone, that he'd been at work when Katie texted him about leaving her car, keys, and bank card, and said she was going to check herself into a clinic. He even let them search his house and his van, and they didn't find anything suspicious. So, the police left, but they did open a missing persons case. Just to cover all bases, they called around to a bunch of clinics, hoping maybe Katie really had checked herself in somewhere, but not a single one had seen her. The next morning, police began piecing together a timeline of Katie's disappearance. And naturally, all eyes were on Andy's house, since that's where her car had been found. Detectives learned there was a surveillance camera nearby, so they pulled the footage from the previous couple of days. On April 21st, the day before Katie went missing, she was seen pulling up to Andy's house. The footage showed her getting into his van, kissing him and smiling. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But the next morning, at 9:20 a.m., things took a very different turn. That was the day Andy told police he'd been at work when Katie supposedly dropped off her car. But the footage said otherwise. It clearly showed Katie arriving at his house, getting out of her car, and climbing into the passenger seat of Andy's van. And right there behind the wheel was Andy himself. Police immediately checked traffic cameras along the direction the van had gone and eventually spotted it again. This time, the van stopped at a McDonald's, then headed out toward the highway. The final footage showed Andy turning onto a rural back road, leading into a wooded area. After that, the van disappeared from view for nearly an hour. But then it popped up again, heading back the way it came. This time, though, there was only one person in the vehicle. So now, a much darker picture was starting to form. Based on the footage, it looked like Andy had driven Katie out to a wooded area and then left without her. After reviewing the surveillance videos, police pulled location data from Katie's phone on the day she went missing. The records showed that her phone disconnected from the tower near her house early that morning, then reconnected near Andy's home. From there, the phone's path followed the exact route the van had taken. But soon enough, things stopped lining up. According to the location data, Katie's phone was still in the van as it headed back towards Andy's place. The problem was, Katie was no longer in the van. And then came the final piece. Investigators checked the time those strange messages were sent to Katie's mom and kids. And by that point, Andy had already returned home alone. But location data clearly showed that those texts were sent from his house. Given that all the evidence directly contradicted Andy's version of events, police decided to head back to his house. And the moment they stepped inside, something fell off. The place was boiling hot. Turns out, Andy had fired up the wood-burning stove, despite the weather being pretty mild outside. Right away, detectives suspected he might have been trying to destroy some evidence. But by the time they got there, all that was left in the stove was ash. Even so, they arrested Andy and brought him in for questioning. Surprisingly, he didn't seem nervous at all. In fact, he looked completely relaxed and stuck to his original story, claiming Katie had probably checked herself into a clinic to deal with her anxiety. When detectives started pressing for more answers, he shut down completely and said he wouldn't talk without a lawyer. So once again, they were left with nothing. After the interrogation, police decided to launch a large-scale search operation in the forest where Katie's phone had last pinged, right before Andy was seen driving back alone. But covering that area wasn't an easy task. They were looking at roughly 25 miles of rugged terrain. Still, they pulled in dozens of officers, requested backup from other agencies, and headed out into the woods. Soon, they had helicopters with thermal imaging, drones, specialized equipment, and even a team of divers. Volunteers joined in too, and the search quickly became one of the biggest operations their town had ever seen. But even with all that manpower, it still wasn't enough to cover such a huge area. Then, out of nowhere, police got a tip. Someone had seen Andy's van parked in a specific part of the forest. That changed everything. Now that they had a likely spot, they were able to narrow the search down to a 5-mile radius. As the search teams combed through the forest, detectives brought Andy in for another round of questioning. This time, they laid out the surveillance footage and other evidence they'd gathered. And now, faced with the facts, Andy changed his story. He admitted that he and Katie had driven out to the woods, but what he said next left investigators baffled. According to Andy, the two of them went there to have a picnic. He claimed Katie had a habit of writing down her thoughts in a journal and then burning the pages as a way to let go of things that were bothering her. He insisted that morning had been no different. They had a picnic, lit a small fire, she burned a few pages, and then, according to him, he drove home. As for what happened to Katie after that, he said he had no idea. Of course, detectives didn't buy Andy's story. But the problem was, they still didn't have any solid leads. The search teams had come up empty, and with no trace of Katie in the woods, investigators shifted their focus to her relationship with Andy. According to her family, Katie had met him 3 years earlier. He had 2 kids from a previous marriage, worked in construction, and at first he seemed like a reliable, stable guy. But it didn't take long for her loved ones to notice cracks in the relationship, and he had a habit of trying to control Katie, telling her how to act, how to talk, even how to think. He also constantly brought up her anxiety, using it as a way to dismiss anything she said or did that he didn't like. And over time, that pressure only made her anxiety worse. Eventually, Andy offered to pay for her treatment, and Katie agreed. But as time went on, things just kept getting worse. The fights became more frequent, more intense, and eventually the relationship fell apart. For Katie, breaking up felt like a weight off her shoulders. But for Andy, it was something he just couldn't accept. Not long after they split, Katie discovered someone had slashed the tires on her car. She was certain it was Andy, but she never reported it to the police. A few months before Katie went missing, she got a letter from the court saying she owed Andy £4,000, the amount he'd spent on her treatment. Katie was already struggling to cover basic expenses for her and her kids, and she had no idea how she'd come up with that kind of money. Over time, late fees piled on, and the debt grew to £6,000. The whole situation sent her anxiety through the roof. She was terrified she'd lose her home, and with it, the only stable place her kids had. But more than anything, she was afraid of Andy. In one message to her mom, Katie said she was scared of him and genuinely believed he might hurt her. She even told her sister, "If anything ever happens to me, look at Andy first." Still, just a month before she disappeared, Andy reached out to her. He told her he regretted ever taking her to court. He promised to drop the case and even said he'd pay all the extra fees that had built up since the ruling. Andy apologized for his anger, told her he wanted to change, and eventually, Katie forgave him. Despite everything, they got back together. Still, detectives found something even more disturbing. Just one day after Andy promised to fix everything with the court, he actually called the debt collectors and told them to go harder on Katie. He wanted them to push her even more. Investigators believe this was all part of his plan to increase the pressure on her, making her even more dependent on him. Katie, of course, had no idea this was happening because Andy kept telling her he was working on canceling the whole thing. A few weeks later, he called the debt collectors again, this time claiming that Katie had shown up at his house and attacked him. Once again, he pushed them to go after her for the money as quickly as possible. When they got in touch with Katie, she freaked out, but Andy brushed it off, telling her she was just being dramatic and there was no reason to panic. He said he was still working on getting the court ruling overturned, but that it was complicated and would take time. And then, just like before, he went right back to telling her she needed help, that something was wrong with her. This gave detectives an even darker picture of what they were dealing with. All the evidence pointed to one thing. Andy was a skilled manipulator and a compulsive liar who would do anything to get what he wanted. And soon, detectives got even more confirmation of that theory. People who knew him said the same thing. They told investigators that Andy had a way of getting into people's heads and controlling them, something he'd been doing for years, even with those closest to him. But even with all that, police still had no clue where Katie was. The search dragged on, day after day, with no trace of her. But then, finally, investigators caught a break. A local man came forward with a strange story. He said that the morning after Katie went missing, Andy randomly showed up at his house. They didn't know each other, but Andy walked up to him and asked him a weird question. "Do you know when your bins were last emptied?" That immediately raised red flags. Officers rushed over and found that the trash bins outside hadn't been picked up in several days. They started digging through the garbage, and inside one of the bags, they found something chilling. It was stained with blood, and inside were Katie's sandals. A DNA test confirmed that the blood was hers. At that point, detectives were sure of one thing. Katie was gone, and Andy was officially charged with her murder. But there was still one huge problem. They had no idea where her body was. Soon after Andy was formally charged with murder, he told detectives he wanted to talk. And just like before, he changed his story yet again. This time, Andy said he and Katie had gone out to the woods that morning for a picnic. While they were sitting by the fire, Katie spotted a hatchet he'd used to chop some wood. And, according to him, she jokingly dared him to throw it and try to hit a soda can she was holding a few feet away. Andy said he took her up on it, but as he threw the hatchet, Katie suddenly leaned forward, and it struck her in the back of the head. Of course, detectives didn't believe a word of it, but this time, Andy at least admitted where her body was. He said that when Katie collapsed and died, he panicked. There was no cell surface in that part of the forest, and according to him, he didn't have the strength to carry her back to the van. So instead, he decided to bury her right there to keep animals from getting to her body. He said he dug a shallow grave, placed Katie's body inside, and covered it with leaves and branches. Then he marked the spot by tying a plastic bag to a stick, planning to come back later. According to Andy, his plan was to go home, say goodbye to his kids, settle everything, and then just be gone. He also admitted to burning Katie's phone along with some of her other belongings in his fireplace. After that, he scooped up the charred remains and dumped them in a trash bin somewhere around town. After speaking with Andy, police headed back to his house, hoping to uncover something new. This time, forensic experts did manage to find traces of blood inside his washing machine, which belonged to Katie. Meanwhile, the search for Katie's body continued. Investigators focused on locating the stick with the plastic bag Andy claimed he'd used to mark the burial site. But even with that clue, search teams still couldn't find the exact spot. While the search was still underway, detectives uncovered something else. After digging into Andy's online activity, they found that he'd been talking to a number of women on various dating sites, flirting with pretty much anyone who'd respond. He'd even been seeing at least one woman in person. According to their conversations, Andy had told her he owned multiple properties across the country. They were even talking about moving to Scotland together and buying a house. But that wasn't even the most interesting part. As they kept going through his phone, investigators discovered something that changed everything. Based on GPS data, the day before Katie vanished, Andy had stopped by his parents' house, then turned off his phone for about an hour and a half. During that time, his van was caught on several surveillance cameras, heading straight toward the woods. After talking to Andy's parents, police found out that the morning before Katie went missing, he'd borrowed a shovel. That's when it hit them. Andy had probably gone out to the woods that day to dig her grave ahead of time. The next day, after killing Katie and using her phone to message her kids and family, Andy also texted his other girlfriend using his own phone. He told her something had come up with his kids and that he'd have to cancel their date. But that wasn't all. In the Notes app on his phone, investigators found something even more disturbing. Drafts of the exact same messages he'd sent to Katie's children and mother. Digital forensics showed that he'd been editing those drafts over the course of several weeks, tweaking them repeatedly, trying to match Katie's writing style so no one would suspect a thing. And most telling of all was the fact that the word "while" was misspelled in the exact same way it appeared in the final messages. It's also worth noting that the note had been created over a month before the murder, and that proved one thing beyond all doubt. Andy didn't just snap. He'd been planning this for weeks, maybe even longer, carefully laying the groundwork for something he knew he was going to do. When police confronted Andy with the evidence that he'd been in the woods the day before the murder, he claimed he had just gone there to walk his dog, not to dig a grave. Soon, search teams finally found the stick with the plastic bag Andy had mentioned, but there was no grave anywhere nearby. They scoured the area inch by inch, but came up empty. So, detectives made a decision. They brought Andy out to the woods and asked him to show them exactly where he'd buried Katie. Once they got there, Andy pointed to a specific patch of ground, and what shocked everyone was that search teams had already been through that exact spot multiple times, but no one had even considered that a grave could be hidden there. The ground looked completely untouched, flat, smooth, and totally natural. No signs of digging, no shifted soil, nothing out of place. It had been concealed so well. Officers later admitted there was no way they would have ever found it without Andy's help. As soon as the forensic team began digging, they found Katie, right where Andy had said she'd be. But what they uncovered next was something no one expected. Somehow, Andy had managed to bury her beneath a web of tree roots that were growing deep underground. Later, a geology expert explained just how complex that grave actually was. According to him, it would have taken hours to dig something like that. There was no way Andy could have done it in one go, so he'd clearly come back more than once. The expert also pointed out that Andy had separated the soil by layers, then buried them back in the correct order, which is exactly why the grave looked so untouched. That level of planning was chilling. Once Katie's body was recovered, it was handed over to forensic examiners. And right away, Andy's story about the Coke can and the axe throw completely fell apart. Katie had died from blows to the head with a hatchet, but not just one or two. She'd been struck 12 times. By that point, there was no doubt in the detectives' minds. This wasn't an accident. This was cold, calculated, and premeditated murder. With all of that, the prosecution began preparing for trial. The evidence against Andy was overwhelming, more than enough to secure a conviction. But one thing remained unclear: the motive. Investigators believed Andy was fueled by bitterness and resentment. Katie had broken up with him months earlier, and it looked like his ego just couldn't handle the rejection. That bruised pride, they believed, turned into hatred and ultimately led him to kill her. The trial began in November 2022, and at first, Andy pleaded not guilty. But just 3 days in, he suddenly changed course. Out of nowhere, he reversed his plea and admitted to the murder. Unfortunately for Katie's family, he didn't offer any new details, just accepted responsibility. But it was still enough, and in the end, the court sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after 32 years, calling him a deeply dangerous individual. And so, the case was officially closed. But the story surrounding Andy still leaves questions. Given that he was dating multiple women at once and constantly pursuing others through dating apps, it's hard to shake the feeling that Katie may not have been the only one. Everything about him pointed to a man who craved control, who seemed to enjoy manipulating and hurting the women around him. And there's every reason to believe that Katie might not have been the first.